economic impact of changing immigration policies. We talked to a local scholar analyzing the business impacts of the Trump administration's crackdown on undocumented workers and foreign born students. Later in the program, we talked to a local nonprofit tackling the challenges female veterans face as they transition from military careers to the civilian workforce. But first, the nation's immigration policies seem to change almost daily, making it tougher for employers to comply with the law. Here to discuss how companies are responding in an uncertain time is Madeline Zavodny. She's a professor of economics at the University of North Florida, as well as a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Zavodny, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, your research focuses on economic issues related to immigration, and you've written a few books on it. You've studied it for many years. How surprising to you is the pace of change that you're seeing now?
It's very hard to keep up as an academic, and I'm sure it's even harder for immigrants, their families, and employers to understand what's going on. The pace of change really feels unprecedented.
You have appeared on Marketplace Morning Report, which airs on our morning show, Morning Edition, a number of times. Most recently, you were talking about E-Verify, which is something that employers use to vet potential employees. And the use of that has gotten more complicated now for employers who are trying to make sure that the people that they hire have the proper documentation. Can you kind of explain why that's getting more complicated?
Sure. So, E-Verify is a website run by the Department of Homeland Security that most employers in Florida and in several other states are required to run new hires through. So, when you get a job, you're supposed to present documents that indicate that you are eligible to be employed legally in the United States. So, in Florida and some of these other states, what the employer does is they enter that information into this website called E-Verify, and then they get a notification that kicks back if you're approved or not. And if you're not, presumably it's because you are an unauthorized immigrant who's not supposed to be working. And then you're supposed to either correct the record or the employer can't retain you as an employee. The challenge that's going on right now is that large numbers of unauthorized immigrants are losing their work permits. Now, one important question is, if they're unauthorized immigrants, how do they have work permits? And this is really a relic of the Biden administration, that in an attempt to reduce the number of people crossing the border illegally, the Biden administration was allowing large numbers of people to enter legally through ports of entry. They didn't get a visa, but they were able to get a work permit and what's called humanitarian parole. Then, in addition, there are numbers of immigrants who have filed an amnesty application, and they're allowed after 6 months to work while that amnesty application is in progress. So basically, we have this large, millions of unauthorized immigrants who have been allowed to work. And the Trump administration now is beginning to remove that temporary protected status from these immigrants and beginning to deport them and revoking that work permit.
So these are people who are essentially have been hired, had permission to be here, at least temporarily, a temporary protective status, who have that status revoked, and then suddenly they're no longer legal to be employed.
Absolutely. They're no longer legal to be employed. They're no longer legal to be in the United States. And so there's this expectation that they will self-deport on the part of the Trump administration.
But that for an employer who has gone in and they may have hundreds of employees or they may have just a few, but they went in when they hired this person, they checked, they confirmed that they were legal to be hired and be in this country and hired them. And so what are they expected to do now? Are they expected to go back through all of their employee roles and double check everybody to make sure that they're still legal? How are companies handling this?
So what the Department of Homeland Security has told the employers to do is to go back into the E-Verify portal and see if those employees' work permits have been revoked. And if so, then they're supposed to dismiss those employees.
It seems like it could be enormously costly or time consuming.
It is time consuming. And for Florida, this is a very big deal because there was this program called CHNV. And so this stood for Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. That was over 530,000 immigrants admitted through this humanitarian parole process with work permits. And think about where, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela are. Most of those immigrants, maybe as many as 80% of them, ended up in Florida. And again, they were allowed to work legally, basically, as soon as they entered into the United States. Now, they had a sponsor, who was usually a family member here. They were vetted and so on, but they no longer are legally present in the United States. They're expected to leave. Employers are not allowed to keep them. And again, the E-Verify is one of the ways in which the Department of Homeland Security is trying to change what's the kind of status and work, whether these people have a job.
So there has been obviously a lot of support, at least there was, initially in the administration for these, mass deportations, for these stricter immigration policies. They've had an impact. We've seen, immigration at the southern border revert to kind of almost nil. And so, it's had this impact. There's some indication, some polling that suggests, perceptions, attitudes might be changing a little bit about the, intensity of that enforcement and how it actually looks. But you've been looking at, these issues for a long time in terms of how they impact the economy. And there's a lot of people that believe that, once these, um, especially people who are not legal to the country, who came here without documentation, once they're gone, that all of these jobs are going to open up and there's going to be this boom to the economy. And your research has shown that's not the case. Can you kind of explain what the factors are that figure into why it could actually be hurtful or harmful to the economy?
Sure. So your typical unauthorized immigrant who works has a very different job than the average legal immigrant in the United States, and particularly than the average US native. In particular, they're in very low skilled jobs that don't require a lot of formal education, and that often these jobs are sort of temporary, transitory. Maybe they're day labor hanging out at the Home Depot, they're working as construction laborers, they're working in the back of the restaurant, they're working as maids and cleaning staff in hotels and so on. These are very arduous, difficult, low paying jobs, and they're typically not held by a lot of people who have legal papers. In particular, they're not held by US natives. So they're not competing with the vast majority of Americans for jobs. And indeed, their labor helps some Americans either sort of move up the food chain, if you will, the job market ladder into supervisory jobs or jobs that are higher paid, require more education, more skills. But also, these immigrants, they buy things. In some cases, they create their own companies. They provide a lot of assistance to private households, either working as nannies, as lawn care, and so on, and that are allowing a lot of people to have a higher standard of living and to work more than they otherwise would be able to. So there's a lot of effects throughout the labor market and the economy that are somewhat surprising to people.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to UNF economics professor Madeline Zavodny about how employers are impacted by some whipsawing immigration policies. You can join our conversation by giving us a call at 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. And obviously, tax revenue is another whole area of economic impact. That taxes that are typically paid by people, whether they have or do not have legal status, they do pay taxes, and so that is a loss. Um, but this is not necessarily just people who are recent arrivals. This is people who've been here for decades. Can you talk about the economic impact of, ha- or is there a difference in economic impact when you take someone who is more established within a community and perhaps has, a family or their own business or whatever versus somebody who's a more recent arrival? Is there a measurable different economic impact?
I think the longer someone has been here, the more integrated they are into the US economic and social fabric, the more likely that they have US born children, and the less likely they are to leave as a result of the changes that are happening in policy. And probably the more costly it's going to be to their employer, as well as to the whole fabric of the society, the community around them, if they do leave. What is somewhat surprising, though, I think, and I have a recent report that called a Dallas Fed Economics blog post at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas that came out that goes through and it tries to estimate the effect of different potential policies under the Trump administration on U.S. GDP growth. So, how fast our economy is growing and on the pace of inflation. And perhaps not surprisingly, that the higher deportations and the smaller inflows of unauthorized immigrants might be, the more negative the impact will be on GDP growth. But what was surprising to us is that the negative impact is really coming from the drying up of inflows. So, as you mentioned, Anne, net inflows at the border of unauthorized immigrants are basically around zero. It's been very hard to enter, and there's not a lot of reason to try to enter right now, perhaps because uh, of the political situation going on and the difficulty of getting a job and integrating into the United States. And this net inflow will have economic repercussions, the model that we estimate shows. And they're pretty sizable. What is surprising is that it doesn't have a big impact on inflation. So maybe that's a bit of good news.
But what kind when you say it'll have an impact, how does that manifest for just ordinary folks, for our listeners? Does it hit them in the pocketbook, in a way that they can see, or is it more of a trend that they'll feel over a period of years and decades?
It's a trend that you'll experience without necessarily knowing it. So, one thing that happened, remember when we were coming out of COVID, right? And things started reopening. So, we started going out to eat again, right? And what would happen to my husband was we would go to a restaurant and half the tables would just be closed. They wouldn't be seating people because they didn't have enough staff. And then over sort of the next year or so, the restaurants were able to hire a lot of people because we had this big surge of people coming into the United States, we could often without visas, and it allowed the businesses to staff up. So I think that this is one thing that's going to happen is that just some goods and services won't be available, or they might be available at higher prices, perhaps.
I want to talk a little bit about the impact on higher education, which is obviously, kind of the field you work in, but also something that you've studied in terms of how foreign students impact the economy. Um, I saw some research, and I apologize that I can't remember if it's specifically your research that found that of the U.S. trade surplus last year, this almost $300 billion trade surplus that the U.S. has on services, that about between 50 and $60 billion of that was from foreign students, things that they bring to the economy. They pay for tuition, fees, housing, food, and that translates into hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Yes, the estimates are that it's over 300,000 jobs in the United States are supported by international students. So this is mainly university students. And interestingly, they're mostly graduate students. So something that I hear sometimes from my students is, well, when international students are coming, they're taking away slots at universities from US students. And that is usually not the case. Now, it might be at a few very elite universities, but the reality is that at most public institutions in the United States, international students are cross subsidizing domestic students, that they pay a much higher rate of tuition. They're paying full room and board as well. And this allows the universities to sometimes, indeed, the research by Kevin Shee, who's at the University of California, Riverside, shows to charge lower tuition to American students at the university level, as well as to offer more courses, more sections of courses, and so on. But again, most of those students are graduate students, and so that's something that most Americans maybe aren't thinking about graduate school. They're hoping to go to college, and so they're not really competing with Americans for slots.
We've got a call from John on the South Side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm just curious, based on the focus on the economics of immigration, considering the current circumstance and the tremendous amount of pushback against deporting people that are here that are considered being here illegally. Are there examples in other countries, economies, to where a more open border sort of situation where you're not being vetted based on asylum or meeting certain criteria? Is an open border shown to be better for the economy of the entire country? Okay, sorry, that was a little drawn out, but thank you.
Yeah, I think we get it, John.
I don't think there are any countries that have open borders, including the United States. The closest probably is thinking about the European Union, that if you're a European Union citizen, you can go work in other European Union countries, right? And so this was what Brexit took the UK out of that sort of open EU borders situation. And I think it has been tremendously beneficial, particularly to the poorer countries within the EU, like Poland, for example, that their citizens were able to go to higher wage countries, send money back home, and then ultimately maybe came back home with a new set of skills, created new businesses at home, and so on.
Overall, though, as the European Union model, was it economically beneficial for the European Union? I mean, there certainly was a lot of pushback, and I think Brexit partially motivated by kind of a reaction to numbers of people coming in and disrupting somewhat the the world that existed there.
So I think economically it's beneficial. Culturally, it's a shock to people. And I think that much of the pushback that we're experiencing to immigration in the United States and in other major immigrant countries like Canada, it it gets couched in economic terms, but it's really rooted in cultural factors.
And is that based on the pace? I mean, is it something that over a longer period is less disruptive or perceived as less disruptive, whether it's economic or cultural?
Over generations, it's absolutely not disruptive. I mean, think about
I guess
if
I mean if the amount of people arriving at a single time is less, if that mitigates some of those assimilation problems.
absolutely that smaller managed flows are more easily incorporated. But on the other hand, it's not clear that their economic benefits are bigger.
Okay. I want to just return briefly to the topic of student enrollment because, additionally, I mean, you talked about how this could really impact graduate student programs, but we are seeing a large decline already in, the number of students who are enrolling in these programs. And so I think we can imagine that would impact those schools, but carry that out a little bit further for us. How might it impact schools? What might happen to the schools? And how does it impact the larger economy, if at all?
So, what it will mean is probably that some universities will close some graduate programs. And this is particularly bad for undergraduate students who would have had maybe more TA support from teaching assistants. It's bad for the researchers who would have had the support from the research assistants. And it's bad for Americans who would have wanted to attend those programs alongside American students. Now, the ripple effects in the years to come are, I think, the bigger deal to worry about, which is that some of those international students stay in the United States after graduation. And in particular, they often have degrees in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And these are the fields that we really, really are going to need. Particularly, we want the people who are trained in AI technologies who can do all of this programming and stuff like that. We're going to want the engineers. And a huge share of them have traditionally been international graduate students who then stay in the US and contribute to our economy. And we're cutting that off.
Just in terms of, your forecast for particularly Florida, what are you going to be looking at? What indicators are you most interested in this next period, whether it's through the end of the year or through the end of this administration?
Well, certainly, I'm hoping that we get through hurricane season without anything horrible happening, because I don't know how we would rebuild because a lot of that very low formal education construction labor force will not be available. That would be very necessary to rebuilding from a hurricane. I'll be keeping an eye on international student numbers throughout the state. And then, we're always interested, of course, in what's happening to the unemployment rate. I would not expect this to lead to a decrease in it at all. And then we might be worried about, what's going on with tax collections and job opportunities.
Are you at all concerned about this merging in some ways of information access when it comes to like the IRS and the Social Security and, immigration generally?
Absolutely. I think we want people to pay their taxes. We also want them to answer government surveys so that we learn about the U.S. population, be they foreign born or American born, legally present or not. And so the less trust people have in the government and the less they cooperate with it, the harder it will be to understand what is going on. Returning to the question about Florida, the other thing I would worry about is that much of Florida's population growth has traditionally come from international migration, be it coming up from Latin America or snowbirds coming down from Canada, and whether that is going to
Mm.
just end and what that's going to do to housing prices.
I do want to take just briefly a call from Ed on the West Side. Ed, if you can go ahead, thank you.
Thank you. A question about the temporary permit to stay that have been given to groups now and in the past. It's been going on for decades now. The question I have is, it seems like the temporary part never occurs. Has there ever been a group that have been given temporary who actually were, and after a year or two or three or four or five, where they basically apply the temporary part, it always end up to stay. I don't blame them. It's sort of like if you have somebody come over to your house because they had a bad situation they're coming from, a disaster or who knows what, for temporary staying in your house, and the person never leaves. So eventually you're going to be very sensitive to allowing somebody else to come over to your house.
Ed, thank you.
You're right that Salvadorans got temporary protected status decades ago, and every 18 months it has been renewed. But I think one thing most people don't understand is that there's no viable path for most people who have temporary protected status to get a visa, become a legal permanent resident, and be on a pathway to U.S. citizenship. We just don't have those routes available in the United States for most people. And things in their home countries, unfortunately, in many cases, haven't improved. There have been a couple of countries, even before the Trump administration, where temporary protected status ended. But you're right. For the most part, the temporary part is in name only.
So you're saying there really is no actual mechanism for people with TPS to make a transition to applying for a visa or permanent residency?
No, under a 1996 law, if you entered the U.S. illegally, you have to go back home in order to adjust status. So imagine you've had a kid, right? And when that kid turns 21, they can sponsor you for a green card, in theory. You have to go back home in order to start that process. And as soon as you do that, you're hit with a 10-year reentry bar.
Wow. It's amazing. There are some policies out there that never cease to amaze me that they that's really interesting. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I so appreciate you coming on, Dr. Zavodny. It's a pleasure to meet you. We appreciate your work. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you.